Yar?
Apparently saying caca just turned on. Apparently saying caca Cortana on my computer. That was weird. Cortana on my computer. That was weird.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen. Oops, I'm echoing. Let me just mute myself. Welcome to the PANTSRAAD. Can everybody hear me? Chat, can you hear me? Can you hear everyone?
Here, here.
Hello.
We are here.
Welcome.
Okay, good. By the authority granted to me by the Speaker Rock, I hereby call this session of the PANTSRAAD to order. The resolution before the House is water wet? Today's debate will proceed as follows. Each member will be given 60 seconds to make their opening remarks. Following opening arguments, the floor will be open to moderated debate. A reminder to delegates that comments should be addressed to the Speaker. Following the debate session, each member will be given 30 seconds to make final arguments. After final arguments, the audience will then vote on the resolution. Any questions before we begin?
No, sir.
None.
Then let us begin the opening arguments with the Honorable and not present, Mr. Squick.
Attention, dickheads. Hello, it's me, the man with the crowbar, the one and only It's Squick, and I'm here because I've got opinions. And you're gonna hear them because you can't stop me. I'm a recorded message from the future of the past of the future. Look, it's a time loop. Don't worry about it. It's probably fine. Anyway, I talked to The Rock. And it had opinions and thoughts, and I'm not going to share them here because, well, The Rock does The Rock's business, and we don't want to get in the way of that. Anyway, the point is that if you really stop and think about it, we all know that basic liquid hydration is important, and as such, it's important to hydrate your liquids. Sometimes you can do that with a powder, and you get like double milk, or sometimes you do that with beans, like a chili, which is a soup. Probably. It could be a sandwich. Look, it's complicated. Anyway, I'm out of time. Water is wet. Fuck you. Go.
Thank you, Squick.
You're here.
The Honorable Sire of Sons for the negative team. You have 60
Greetings,
seconds.
one and all. I am of the opinion, with my team member here, Cookie Mama, that water is not wet. Water cannot be wet because for something to be wet, its molecules must be covered by another substance that is in a liquid state. But the important part is that there is a difference in the states of matter between the non-liquid state matter and liquid state matter. I should note I have absolutely no scientific expertise in this, but you should definitely trust what I have to say on this subject. I am very smart. Believe me. So, if the difference is what is important when it comes to wetness, then it must be said that water is not wet. Because from one point of water to the next point of water is still a liquid state. There is no gas or solid and then liquid and then non-liquid. It's just liquid, non-liquid. Therefore, water is not wet. I end my opening statement.
The Honorable Kaiju Fro for the affirmative. You have 60 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, PANTSRAAD. I posit this. When you are told you should wet something down, what do you do with it? You put water on it. Water, it transfers the wet property to whatever you put the water on. Therefore, water has wetness within it. To go to the scientific issue that Sire of Sons brought up, depending on your field of study, whatever element you're looking at, if you're, say, an astronomer, all elements are metallic. It's a matter of semantics. The reality is the world that we live in. And in the world we live in, if you want to wet something down, you put water on it. Therefore, water is by itself wet. thanks to the transitory property of wetness. I yield the rest of my time.
The Honorable Cookie Mama for the negative. You have 60 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, members of the PANTSRAAD, chat and large, I posit that water is not wet. And I have two arguments which I will present this evening. One is that the word wet is the wrong descriptor, and the other that the surface tension of the water means that it is not surrounded by a liquid. There are two there. The first argument is that wet is, as my honorable colleague has said, wet means to be filled with a liquid. If you are that liquid itself, you are not wet. And to be filled with or to be coated with a liquid. And my other argument will be that water is
5 seconds.
There are two parts to water. The
Time.
living. Okay.
The Honorable Headsman Stuka for the affirmative. You have 60 seconds.
As been largely pointed out, I am a Canadian. Today, I demonstrated why you would not want to experience getting wet by water. I was out in the canoe with my friend and his lady in the middle, and we did not, in fact, get wet. I yield the last of my time.
This concludes the opening argument segment of today's debate. I now open the floor for moderated or unmoderated debate. Chaos reigns, go.
You finish your point.
My second point was that there are
The
two
speaker recognizes the Honorable Cookie Mama.
Oh, pardon. To finish my point, Mr. Speaker, there are two parts to a water molecule. One part is it loves the other side, and one part hates the other side. It's and so it makes a bubble, and it's not wet. It makes bubbles. It makes a surface tension and magnets. It makes a cover. That's why when you have a thing of water, it goes just, and you fill it too full, it goes just to the edge because it's hanging on to each other.
Mr. Speaker, point of order or point of personal privilege.
Proceed.
Water as it exists as we drink it, as we see it in our daily lives, as we understand it to be, is in liquid form, not gaseous. If it were to become gaseous, it would become a vapor or steam. And if it were to become a solid, it would become an ice. The water that we're speaking of is the liquid water that one can get from one's tap and then drink down if they're crazy. But the reality is that when we talk about water and when we talk about getting things wet, our mind instantly thinks to get something wet, you put water on it, not in it, because you can't put water in a car to make it wet, but you can put it on a car to make it wet while you clean it. I yield the rest of my time.
Is the honorable member certain that's a point of personal privilege?
Who cares?
Well said.
And eggplant.
Mr. Speaker.
The speaker recognizes the Honorable Stuka.
As to the wetness of water, there are also other ways to bounce off of Kaiju Furo's statement. There are other ways to obviously wet things down. Water is just the most prevalently used resource for such an act. I mean, you could wet things down with liquor, but that's flammable. You could wet things down with gasoline.
Gasoline.
That's shut up. Don't talk about the gasoline. We're not ready for that yet. The gasoline is flammable. And you don't want to be wet with gas. But what you can get wet with that's safe, although inconvenient? Water.
Mm-hmm.
I yield the rest of my time.
Hear, hear.
There is a question from the gallery for the Honorable Cookie Mama. Night Owl asks, can a single water molecule create surface tension, or does it require multiple such molecules in close proximity?
It requires multiple, Mr. Speaker and chat, it requires multiple and in close proximity. So you have to have more than one particle of water.
The speaker would like to interrupt this debate to point out that my cat is on my desk and he is snoring.
Aw.
Oh.
And if you put water on that cat, it would become wet.
Please
And-
do not apply water to the speaker's cat.
Mr.
It
Speaker.
would end very poorly for the speaker. Yes, go ahead.
So continuing with the concept of wetness, water, and other liquids, I have considered, as has been pointed out by the opposing team, that it is not only water that must be considered when we are considering is water wet, because truly the question then is, are liquids wet on their own? With simply in a vacuum, with nothing else, just the liquid. I argue that no, a liquid on itself is not wet. A liquid must be in contact with a non-liquid to be giving the property of wet. The experience of personal wetness is best experienced, for example, when we have liquid state matter, whether it be water or gasoline or something else, touching our skin, but also having air or some other matter in a gaseous form immediately touching other parts of our skin and immediately beyond the liquid state matter in a distance of probably about less than a millimeter generally. If we are, say, fully submerged with no air molecules touching us in regular and rapid intervals, this is a bit of hyperbole because there's often still some gaseous molecules intermixed with most liquids, but not always. If we are submerged, then we are not experiencing wetness so much as we are experiencing submersion. So then, if you were to say take a molecule of water that is completely surrounded by other molecules of water, or yea, even other molecules of some other liquid, say gasoline or oil, it would be difficult to say that that molecule is wet. It is submerged, but not necessarily wet. And so then I would argue that wetness is not necessarily the absence of non-liquid, but the immediate presence of liquid and non-liquid for comparative purposes. I yield.
Here, here.
Mr. Speaker,
Proceed.
I want everyone to think about what it's like in the summertime, say in the southeastern United States, where there is really high humidity. Now, that is a measurement of the amount of water in the air. And if you walk out onto a day that is quite humid, you instantly feel wet, whether it's because of your own sweat or because of the water itself contacting your skin. But the cause of that feeling of wetness is the amount of water in the air. Therefore, that amount of water is transferring the feeling of wetness to everyone who exists in it. They're not submerged, although technically, scientifically, they are because they're submerged in the atmosphere, but they are existing in their day-to-day lives, walking around in the air, and they just feel wet because there's too much water in the air. I yield the rest of my time.
Mr. Speaker.
The speaker recognizes the Honorable Cookie Mama.
Mr. Speaker, to the previous member's point, I would like to say that the water applied to the surface makes it wet, not the water itself. It feels wet because we have surface, we have skin, we have a way to interact with it. However, it is not wet itself. And I yield the rest of my time.
Mr. Speaker.
The speaker recognizes Sire Sons.
Continuing off of my team member has discussed, I believe it is rather important, going back sort of to the molecules and the concept of the surface tension. The surface tension is, of course, when there are multiple water molecules or other liquid molecules that are in close proximity to each other. But for there to be that surface tension, there must then immediately be something to have tension against. Generally, this is going to be some form of gas. typically air. Therefore, since you cannot really have surface tension without then also having immediately a gas, and the liquid must be resting upon something else other than liquid, some container or some solid, as some of the chat has pointed out, then we must understand the wetness. Say, for example, if you have water in a pond, the pond is the whole environment there, but the water itself in the pond is not wet. It has a surface tension against the air above it, applying pressure, and then there are the materials under the pond, the sand, the dirt, the rocks, any of the plants, perhaps. Those things are wet because they are in contact with water. Additionally, there is also, generally speaking, air. Now, I would point out that there is the sort of gray area in, say, a man-made artificial pond, which is perhaps stagnant, and so there's no cycle of water to bring air from the area where the water has surface tension down to the bottom. And so the materials down at the bottom that are wet eventually become not wet because there is no air to interact with them alongside the water molecules. And so eventually they become simply submerged, but no longer wet. It is an interesting state. I yield my time.
There was a question from the gallery earlier. To the Honorable Cookie Mama, Night Owl follows up and asks, if we are to define wet as the quality of being coated with water, is it not a collection of more than a single molecule of water in close contact with another qualify as wet?
And I did answer that, in which I said that it did require.
So answered.
Yeah, did require more than one. You are right. You are right. It does take more than one to be wet, Oh, no. Okay, no, sorry, I misunderstood. I'm rereading it again. It takes,
I may also have misunderstood.
if wet is being coated with water, putting another water molecule with the first water molecule just means it's more water, right? You see, and again, we only ever see this with an interaction with a surface, even if it's the bottom of the ocean or a bottom of a lake. We see, its interaction with something, the air, the surface. If you put a few little droplets of water onto a surface, that surface is wet, but that droplet of water is not wet. It is a droplet of water. It is a bunch of molecules of water. I yield the rest of my time.
Mr. Speaker?
It occurs to me this debate is far too orderly. I'd like to see some more heckling from the members of the floor.
Well, all right.
In my personal opinion, the opposing team is a couple of knuckleheads. I can't say so much about Squick, as he is not present.
Order. Just a little bit of order. The speaker recognizes the Honorable Stucca.
I would posit that the opposing team would suggest that if water is in fact not wet, then anything that wets any substance or surface would also indeed not be wet.
Here.
A response from the member opposite?
I disagree. I think it is the comparative process that is most important in the understanding of wetness.
So it's only convenient that water is wet.
No, water is not wet, because water cannot be compared necessarily with itself. And if you compare water simply to air, that is
Not
insufficient.
liquid.
There must be three things to compare: a solid state,
Ladies and
a
gentlemen,
liquid
we
state,
have
and
a
an
water
acid.
break. We have a water break.
We must wet.
How
our mouths
appropriate.
with water, huh? Convenient.
Yeah.
My inside is already wet.
Yes. On that point, Mr. Speaker, I would like to be recognized.
Sorry, who was that one recognized?
That was me.
Yes, the speaker recognizes the Honorable Kajifro, whose voice I really should recognize by now.
Yeah, probably. But anyway, new mic. anyway, we as human beings are 70% water. And if you take that water out of us, all we are is a bunch of dust. And by having that water, we have things like mucous membranes and, like the inside of our mouths being wet. If you take that water away, the inside of our mouths is not wet. Water causes things to be wet. Therefore, water is itself wet. I yield.
A wetter, if
Well,
you will.
as speaker, I can't take a side in this debate, but I feel I should point out, you know who's not 70% water? The Rock.
In fact, if you add water to the rock, you lower his melting temperature.
That's true, you would.
Yeah.
Let's see, Mr. Speaker,
The speaker recognizes the Honorable Sire of Sons.
going back to the concept of comparison, I believe it is important to recognize that water is, of course, a chemical compound, just as many other things. This discussion of molecules and how they interact with each other. Wetness is a state in a chemical interaction. A chemical cannot really interact with itself to change its own state. It must interact with something else, whether they're changing pressure or energy or contact with another chemical. So a simple existence of one type of molecule, whether it be water or gasoline, cannot change its own state. And wetness is, in a sense, a state, not a terribly scientific state, but it is, nevertheless, a state that we can experience and recognize. Therefore, especially because water, technically speaking, is solid. It is a no, I forget the term, but it will dissolve whatever it touches. It may take an extremely long time, but it is having a chemical interaction with the things it touches. Now, I would then argue then that in order for something to be wet, it must be having a chemical interaction with in between a liquid matter and a solid matter. The presence of air of some kind helps expedite this process.
Boo, come on. Get to a point.
That is the point. That in order for there to be wetness, there must be a chemical process ongoing. But if water is simply existing by itself, it cannot be having that chemical process.
Mr. Speaker.
I yield.
The speaker
Yes.
recognizes the Honorable Kaiju.
Yeah, water never exists by itself. Just having just hydrogen and oxygen in a fluid state, it's a very rare thing. There's always other things in it. There's always inclusions of some kind. It's never chemically neutral unless it's distilled and stored in a glass jar. Most of the time, these chemical reactions are happening. That means that inside it, at all times, there are things making it more wet by having interactions with the little floaties in the water. I mean, come on, man. You're
Those
coming up
things
with a
in the
hypothetical.
water are wet, not the water itself.
The water the transitory property of I'm not wet, water gets on me, I am wet, it comes from the water has the wet in it.
The water has the wet built into its points cost.
It is. Yes.
It is one of its stats.
But there are poisons. Are the poisons themselves poisonous to themselves?
Yeah. They
Mr.
break
Speaker,
down over time.
Speaker recognizes the Honorable Cookie Mama.
there was a question from the audience that I would like to address. If I can find it now, since it was scrolling.
Hurry up.
Heck, where did it go?
I see one question. Can you not be made wet by oil?
Wet by oil. That was it. No, you cannot be wet by oil. You become oily if the surface of whatever is coated with oil. There is if you've ever done dishes, you know the difference between an oily surface and a wet surface. There is a difference because the nature is different.
Yeah. Slippery is just more wet.
The slipperiness is an entirely different type of property. that may
Yep.
or may not be applied by something being wet.
I would
Yep.
say oily and slippery are the same property.
Maybe.
But slippery will not necessarily translate its slipperiness to other things that touch it. But oiliness can very easily translate that state to something else. If you've, washed, say, a plastic container that was previously holding some oily substance, you will find that the oil will become attached to your skin or whatever it is that you clean it with, unless you use a dissolvent.
As an
An
Italian,
exfoliant?
I feel personally attacked by all this talk of oiliness. Can we go to a different subject?
Oh.
Are we ready to proceed with closing arguments, or shall we continue the debate round?
I wish to say this. If the inside of my mouth did not have water in it and was thus wet, I would not be able to do this. I yield.
I'm on your team, but what?
Hey, I made a wet sound with my mouth. It's the only thing I have to do in this audio medium. But
It was very quiet.
oh well, that's it. That's because my microphone apparently has noise canceling. Doesn't matter. I made imagine a weird sickly sound. I made it.
A raspberry?
Can water
Right.
make its own wet sounds?
If a tree falls in the woods, who cares?
Yeah. See?
Yes, water
Moist.
can.
Moist.
Have you ever heard of waves?
Someone, Sparafacil 1978, has said the word moist. This brings me to what I believe would be close to my ending argument. Moist is often used as a substitute for the word wet. Can it be said that water is itself moist? I would say no,
Absolutely.
because moisture is simply the existence of something in contact with something else. Humidity was mentioned earlier, but the humidity is not itself humid. It is humidity simply by the existence of water or liquid molecules in the air, suspended in it. We would not call it humid if there was no comparison to make. If the air was simply filled with water everywhere, if you were submerged,
Like
well,
the fog.
it wouldn't be humid anymore, because then there would be no real significant comparison to make between, say, the liquid and the air. There are, technically speaking, air molecules in the water, but not significant enough to really make a comparison.
Humidity is a measure of the amount of air in water in the air.
Yes, but if there is no air,
Then you're in a lake.
yes, and
And you're
that is not humid.
I would argue that it is the most humid you could be.
Sir, I raise your argument one splayed hand and an eggplant.
Yes, I accept that eggplant. And
Do
I
not
put my
quote
own
the
straight
deep
hand on
magic
it.
to me. I was there when it was written.
Here, here.
You can't, you will never be able to convince me. My brain is far too spongy.
And
Everything, you just squeeze it and everything goes out.
I understand. Mine is too smooth and wet.
smooth brain.
Are we ready to proceed to closing arguments?
I am, Mr. Speaker.
I am.
All right.
Aye.
Then we shall begin closing arguments with the Honorable Stucca for the affirmative. You have 30 seconds.
In closing, it is preposterous to assume that water itself is not cannot wet itself. Water touching water will become more water, yes, because the water makes itself wet together, and it sticks together through its wetness and makes anything else wet with its sticky wetness. Water is wet, and so is anything else that's wet. Even oily stuff, that's still pretty wet. I conclude my time.
The Honorable Cookie Mama for the negative. You have 30 seconds.
Water is not wet. Wet is the application of water to a surface, whether it be the air, us, or other various things like dirt. Therefore, we know that if you apply something to something else, the thing that you are applying it is not that with the nature changer is
Time.
not the nature. Thank you.
The Honorable Kaiju for the affirmative. You have 30 seconds.
My argument is simple. Water must be wet because when you are wet, it's because water is on you. Water transfers the feeling of wetness to you. It's just a descriptor. It's an adjective. It's not a scientific word, but it is in its nature a wet thing. I yield.
The Honorable Sire of Sons for the negative. You have 30 seconds.
Water, wetness, moist, damp, humid, soaked. All these words are all words of comparison, often used interchangeably, all in relation to water or other liquids. It must be said that something can give something else a property it itself does not have simply by interacting with it. Through comparison, we can experience such an adjective. Wetness, moisture.
Time. And finally, the Honorable and not present Squick for the affirmative.
Huh. Well, both sides raised a number of interesting points, but the problem here is that one is objectively wrong. And I'm calling you out here, side standing against me, because personally, I believe I'm correct when I say that water is indeed quite wet. And as evidence for this, I'd like to point out the fact that I'm usually right on account of the way that I am. Also, The Rock likes me best. You're all a bunch of jerks. Screw you. Googly eyes. Hooray. Hand eggplant. I'm out. Bye.
Here, here.
Here,
I believe I have the Rock's love.
With the closing arguments concluded, I will now begin the poll in Twitch chat. Audience, you have 1 minute to vote. Is water wet? Yes or no? And if I'd prepared ahead of time, I would have had some like Jeopardy music or something here. But yeah, there it is.
Oh, the no's are winning.
Oh,
Uh,
yes, it's catching up. Oh, they're losing the
Oh.
lead. They're losing the lead.
Oh,
and
Any
it's-
last minute appeals to the audience? Now is the time, delegates.
How can water
Water's
not
not
be
wet.
wet? Seriously, people.
Water's
wanna-
wet.
soaked.
Water's not wet. Water's
When you're
not
told
wet.
to wet your hair, what do
you
you do?
heard
You
her.
put
She
water
said
on it.
water is wet.
Water's not wet.
But it's the water that's in your hair. Is it wet? No, the hair is wet, not the water.
With water. It is wet with water.
Dampness and soaked are versions of wetness. They are measurements of wetness.
Did you just say virgins of wetness?
We'll go with that.
Ah! The
Poll has
no
concluded
wins.
13 to 12. Water is not wet.
Yay!
A very
Their
close
vote
debate.
then gets added to ours. We have to have our up and down.
What?
Don't we have to have a vote too? Like
Dude,
all of
I
us?
mean, did you
Yeah,
guys not
Chad
vote
only
in the
gets-
Twitch poll?
Hell no.
Why not?
Because we
No,
vote here. And then we add their vote to ours.
At the beginning, it was stated that this vote would be handed to the audience.
It was, yeah. You guys should have voted.
Wow.
Oh, damn.
Good job.
All right, there we are. The
We're on our
PANTSRAAD has spoken. Water is not wet. It is resolved. Ladies and gentlemen, assembled delegates, Mr. Speaker Rock, thank you all for your attendance this afternoon. Hail Cargonia.
Hail
Hail Cargonia.
Hail.
Yeah.